Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, a podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of mental health and psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy body, mind, and spirit. I'm Reid Robison, psychiatrist, and my co-host, the illustrious Steve Thayer, was just coming back from a voyage and will be with us next week. But today we get to hear from Garyth Moxey, a brave, seasoned, and compassionate healer and activist based in Vancouver with a ton of real-world experience working with Ibogaine and 5-MeO DMT for addiction and a number of other conditions at a treatment center he founded called Inner Realms. You may recognize Garyth from the original Dosed movie back in 2019, where he shared some of his Ibogaine work. And in this fun conversation, Garyth also walks us through his early exposure to psychedelic culture in the UK in the 80s, where he traveled with the Peace Convoy to festivals like Stonehenge. He also walks us through some of his journey with addiction, including a few stints in rehab, AA meetings in Southeast Asia, and a particularly profound, intentional LSD journey that helped him kick some serious addictions so that he could carry forward this really inspiring work that Garyth does on the front lines of some serious addiction in downtown Vancouver. A big thank you to Garyth for sharing his story and his wisdom with us. And he was even plugging in from Mexico right after facilitating a Bufo retreat. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Garyth Moxey. Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers. I'm Reid Robison, and I'm excited to be here with Garyth Moxey, a new friend, and looking forward to this conversation. Garyth, welcome.
Hey, Reid. Thanks for having me. I much appreciate it for giving me the space to explain a little bit about what we do.
Yeah, I can't wait. Could you start by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself, whatever you'd like to share by way of introduction?
Sure. My name's Garyth Moxey. I am 59 years old. I was born in Canada in 1965 by two very young parents who promptly broke up when I was at a very young age. They were British and they emigrated to Canada. So I was born in Montreal. I stayed in Canada until I was 8 years old. And then I moved with my mother to Britain, to the southwest of Britain. So in many respects, I'm kind of a Brit with a Canadian passport that's been away for a very long time. I was raised in the UK. I had some difficulties with school. I had ADHD, which was just shitty kid syndrome back then. So schooling and everything was a tough time for me, and quite a traumatic time, actually, I think. And I kind of fell into problematic drug use at a very young age. Or actually, as I look back, I think the first things I was doing in that kind of way was overeating. Food was the first thing I do. I remember I'd get home from school and if I could find a bag of Macintosh apples in the kitchen, my mum wasn't around, then I'd eat 3 or 4 and then just be lying back with a really bad stomach. And as I cast my mind back, that was kind of the first time that I was engaging in kind of problematic addictive behavior. I started smoking at a very young age, immediately fell in with the bad crowd, started smoking at 9 with the other kids behind the bike shed.
Oh, wow.
And what have you. Back then we could get cigarettes out of machines in the street in packs of 10, which was just like pocket money size, and then also being from the UK, we all started drinking at a very young age. I think that really there's something of a cultural obligation to be engaged with alcohol. A place like pretty much all of Europe, but places like Britain and Germany, I think, are particularly bad in that respect. And so So I started drinking at a young age as well. And we had access to getting alcohol at a young age as well, before 16, actually, in Britain.
What is
Yeah.
the drinking age out there? I grew up in Canada. I have two passports as well. Born in the U.S., but picked up a Canadian one along the way. But in high school out there was a bar at my prom because it was 5 years of high school and you could drink at age 19. But I assume it's the same in the UK.
18.
18, wow.
And like in the late 70s, early 80s, that kind of age thing was, was not adhered to quite as much as it is now. So I remember actually buying cider and stuff from the off licenses, which was just like a hatch at the back of the pub where they do off sales. And I was getting alcohol at 14, 15. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
We all started drinking at quite a young age, and I looking back on it, my problematic drinking started by about 16 or something like that. But in a country like Britain, it's not really considered problematic drinking. It's just kind of like, normal. I feel that they think of somebody as an alcoholic as somebody, or somebody with an alcohol use disorder might be somebody that's on the street. Back then when we were kids, there'd always be like, well, we called them tramps, and they were, usually older guys with no fixed abode that had alcohol problems, and they would pick up money daily from Social Security and just be drinking. So I think in Britain at that time, that is what was considered alcoholic if you'd lost your home and you were on the streets. So any other problematic drinking was just considered like, boisterous young behavior or whatever. But as I cast my mind back, it's very problematic.
Did you feel primed for addiction? I'm thinking of the heritability, right? And the balance of nature versus nurture, which I think is not a versus at all. It's always both, right? Where genetics makes us predisposed to something, but you might be in an environment around alcohol or nicotine, for example. But wondering if you felt like you were particularly at risk and where that comes from in your view of yourself.
Well, I think the neurodivergence had a lot to do with that. In some respects, and then also maybe some early trauma as well. It took 48 hours for me to come into this world, and then I was in an incubator for 3 weeks, and so all of those things can contribute. But I think that the neurodivergence played into that. It's a combination of a bunch of things, and then just kind of finding yourself in that environment as well. Because actually, once I started smoking cannabis, I stopped drinking because it was much less harmful for me than alcohol. So I started smoking cannabis at a young age as well. But interestingly, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, you go ahead.
At a young age, because we were lied to quite extensively about the harms of drugs and things. So, everything's kind of lumped into one. Cannabis and LSD are in there with heroin, and everybody's telling you, from the state's point of view, they're all just as equally as bad as each other. So when I started smoking pot, actually things got a little better because I stopped drinking. And so there was a lot of mistrust of what the government was saying about drugs. And then being a younger person, quite a younger, adventurous sort of person, I did fall into heavier drug use. By the time I was 19, I had become an IV speed user. Or actually, the first thing that I used, IV drug that I used was heroin. And I thought that was the best thing since sliced bread. So I thought I'd better not engage with opiates, and I thought it would be much safer to shoot speed instead. So
how long of a time period were you in that trap or hooked on? Was it a daily dependence?
2.5 years of a very
Mm-hmm.
heavy speed use. I got all entwined with Lou Reed in the Velvet Underground, and all the romance of the IV junkie kind of thing. And when you're like 19, 20, I mean, that's when young men do things that we don't have much thought about death or things like that. That's the kind of time in life when young men engage in very risky behavior, whether it's riding a motorcycle at ridiculously high speeds, shooting speed up your arm, all of that kind of reckless behavior. I was engaging in at that time, but I was also quite conscious of that, and when I wanted to stop being engaged in that behavior, I found it quite difficult because I'd become, essentially addicted to amphetamines at that point. And I feel that I fell in with amphetamines as well because of the ADHD thing, which I didn't discover until much later in life, that was an issue that I had. But I started going to festivals when I was younger as well. Like the first festival I went to at like 16, I think, was Stonehenge Free Festival, which was about 40 miles up the road. I'd seen, when my father lived in Marlborough, which is close to Stonehenge, and I was visiting him when I was about 12. And I remember seeing all of these buses, like double-deckers and big buses and trucks, and they all had all of this stuff painted over them, like arms and yin-yangs and things. And I said to my dad, who are these people? I remember he was like, oh, that's just a bunch of hippies going to Stonehenge. You don't want to have anything to do with them. And I was very intrigued by them because it was just so not what I was used to seeing in the UK, and actually those are the people that kind of saved me from hard drug use. And so I fell in with those people that were there at the festivals that I used to go to in the summertime, the free festivals. That community, sure, it was they were known as the Peace Convoy, which is a bit like Deadheads. A lot of people living in buses and trucks and everything, or the Rainbow Family, but a lot more less fluffy than something coming out of the States. There was a lot of class war, punk, anarchists, really, and how they made their money was by being the main part of a festival. So in Britain, there's a lot of common land, which is even marked on ordnance survey maps. And common land is like Crown land or BLM land, and so travelers have certain rights to being and using the common land, and Britain was very dependent on travelers for doing a lot of the work in the fields and stuff. So having Romany gypsies traveling around the country and staying on common land was quite common. And so we just kind of hitched ourselves to those kind of laws, really. And so then it was just a different group of travelers that were on the road. And they were kind of known as the Peace Convoy by the press, or New Age travelers. So really kind of like a hippie, intentional hippie community that's out on the road, like Romany gypsies. So
yeah. This is fascinating because I'd love to look back at the different chapters of psychedelic and cultural history, if you will, but I'll admit I don't know as much about what was going on at the UK, and I think the people, is it the Peace Convoy, and was it the Battle of the Beanfield? Were you around for that?
Yeah. I wasn't at the Beanfield. I got to Savanac Forest the day after. So yeah,
wow.
But that was that was kind of a turning point in the convoy. Like if that was in 1985, so 1984 was the last Stonehenge, and that was the 12th Stonehenge. And if it had happened in 1985, the authorities would not have been able to stop it, because it had happened. It would have been the 13th year. It would have been set in stone that we were allowed to go and do that every year after that, due to old British laws. And so they put up a roadblock.
Wow.
Actually, what they did was completely illegal. And it was the largest group arrest in British history, where they arrested over 500 people. Yeah. And then smashed everybody's homes and stuff. You can Google
Wow.
Battle of the Beanfield and you can see what happened. It's just atrocious what happened. And in many respects left the community deeply traumatized from that experience.
I bet.
So
yeah, that was wrongful arrest, violence.
Yeah.
When the peace convoy was trying to kind of stand up for their right to be there on the land at the Stonehenge, right? Is that what it was?
Yeah.
And their way of life.
Festival. The festival would run for a month. Like the first travelers would arrive on June the 1st, and then like the last people leaving would be in the beginning of July. So. And the last Stonehenge in 1984, there were over 30,000 people there, with nobody in charge. Nobody's, so it was just everybody gathering, and the travelers kind of set the main drag, I guess. Streets would form, and then we would sell food, or that was the front, you're selling food. Actually, back in the day, people would have signs outside their buses saying LSD, £2.50, this, that, the other, which type of LSD. So it was all just totally out in the open in the first years when I was going to the free festivals. But then photographic evidence started being brought in, so everybody had to be a little bit more discreet as to how they sold their wares.
Yeah. And did you hear about or see a lot of people ending up in hospital emergency departments with bad trips, or did you see a lot of that back then with LSD and other medicines flowing freely?
Oh, and back then as well in the festivals, it was all LSD. There was no MDMA yet. That didn't show up until 98. Yeah. That was our Summer of Love, was 1998 when. And that there was a whole shift then as well. So no, everybody would take LSD at festivals. That's what you did. And I think in all my years of festivals and Burning Man, I went to Burning Man once I got to the States and stuff. And so I've had a lot of years of festivals, and I could probably count on two hands the really outlandish, dodgy shit that I've seen happen from LSD or drug interactions like that. Whereas I used to run a bar sometimes, and I would have crazy shit happening every night that I'd run a bar. So it's far more problematic when I cast my mind back to, and I feel that in some ways the festival was a container, I'm not saying that dodgy things haven't happened at festivals, because they definitely have, especially when they're now as big as Glastonbury. We would go to, I went to Glastonbury in the late 90s, and again, there was like 30 or 40,000 people there. Now there's, I don't know, it's like Burning Man 70,000. Yeah. It was 30,000 when I used to go, so, which is 20 years ago now, so.
That's wild. Wow. And so I'm curious, whatever you're willing to share about how you kicked that addiction to, sounds like methamphetamine, perhaps other things. You connected with this community, but what got you out of that cycle?
I'm not saying it was a completely angelic community, because there was a little bit of hard drugs going on, but it wasn't really kind of out in the open or anything, and hard drugs weren't really being tolerated on the festival sites because there were kids, part of the community, So, but it was just being out of the inner city environment and being with my kind of people, which really were, and the Peace Convoy was filled up with a lot of misfits, anarchists, punks, all kinds, people running from the law, because it was a safe place, because we had protection in numbers, and when we traveled from one festival site to the next, that's how we got known as the Peace Convoy, because it would be a convoy of these old buses going down the road, and the police would be normally stopping traffic to let us just keep moving, so as that we would go out of their county into the next, and then they're like, okay, they're not our problem longer. It's like we push them to Alberta. That's Alberta's problem. But just being in that community, finding communitas, really, with kind of my people, so I was a pretty kind of radical hippie type, I grew dreadlocks and stuff, and it was a bit of a Mad Max lifestyle in some respects, but I felt that we were fighting for people's freedom at the time, to have free festivals, and people should be able to gather. And we gather at these ancient sites. It's part of our heritage and our culture. So, unfortunately, the Thatcher government didn't view it that way. So, and then that government used us as a kind of a diversion for other stuff that was going on. That they were shutting down the coal mines, so they were fighting with the coal miners back then as well. And it was really convenient to have us all over the news as, hippies selling LSD to your children, that kind of thing, kind of, media response and stuff. So, but that was finding community, and then also we lived out in the countryside, so, and not in the inner city, which had a lot of, and back in the 80s, there was really high unemployment. So a lot of people were just coming out of the inner cities and going on the road just because there was nothing for them there apart from hard drugs. We were being flooded with heroin back then as well from Afghanistan, dope for guns and stuff.
Oh, wow.
At first, it was all hash, a lot of Afghani hash. And there was this big thing about smoke the Russians out of Afghanistan. But then, shortly after that, then we start getting lots and lots of heroin from Afghanistan as well.
So, for your kind of journey of healing and growth, you think it was community that was the initial medicine to get away from the hard drugs?
Yes. And then
you work with.
I had fallen in with a community, which was the wrong community. It's the community of drug fiends. Hardcore drug fiends. So. And so what I really need to do is get to those festival people, and they really were my people. I mean, I felt at home at free festivals when I was going to them in the summertime, and then, so it just seemed to be the logical choice. And I had friends that were on the road, and they said, come with us, we'll take you, under our wing. And so I did that for like 5 or 6 years before leaving full time.
I'm thinking about this book on habits and addiction. I don't even remember which book, but where it summed up 3 ways to change your patterns. Say whether it's drug use or like compulsive eating behaviors, and one is like small repeated steps day after day. 2 would be change your environment, and 3 is like a profound, transformative, mystical experience, if you will. And often it's a combination of those, but it sounds like in your case, you had a lot of an environment change, like not around the people using those things, with the container of a community. But I know you work with addiction, and it sounds like you've been through kind of a healing journey of your own, but maybe you can share a bit about the work you do, the medicines you work with, and why.
Sure. Well, I got to a point in Britain in 1990, and I knew that I had to leave Britain. A lot of my friends were getting arrested. The photographic evidence they had been building on people at festivals over the years. So it was time to leave, and so I cut off my dreadlocks and got a one-way ticket to Taiwan. And then I started teaching English to little Chinese kids A, B, C, D, E, F, is that kind of thing. And I stayed in Taiwan for a while. And then I moved to the Philippines. I actually had some help from my father, who lent me some money to start diving, becoming a professional diver. So I worked up to the level of dive master. But while I was there, not really dealing with my addiction issues. I was working in tourism, drinking beer. So my alcohol use got more and more. And that, being in the Philippines, I was away from psychedelics, which had always kind of kept me in check. And a lot of my major decisions in life had kind of been taken after LSD journeys or stuff, I did LSD. I got to go to India. Okay, so I go to India, that kind of thing. And so I felt a little bit lost being away from that occasional deeper check-in with myself. And actually what was happening was my drinking was getting heavier and heavier. And then I found methamphetamine in the Philippines as well. So then there was kind of a combination of and then I'd gone from beer to rum, and so I started kind of tail spinning, if you will, and I moved to a different island, hoping, which I managed to get away from the methamphetamine then, but my drinking just got worse. And friends of mine actually chipped in together and bundled me on a plane and sent me back to Britain and said, "Don't come back until you've got your shit sorted out." So that was my first stint in traditional rehab. And that's when I kind of really acknowledged the fact that I had a very bad drinking and a drug problem, because when I drink, then everything else is on the table, so one just kind of leads.
Yeah.
So I started going to Alcoholics Anonymous in the Philippines, actually. And there were no Filipinos in Alcoholic Anonymous there. They were all Germans and Swiss and stuff that had gone to the Philippines, and then of course just carried on drinking and stuff. So that was the beginning of I'd done traditional rehab, which didn't work at all. I came back to the Philippines and made life hell for everybody. And then I started going to AA, which kind of planted a seed then. So then I would start to get periods of sobriety. The girl that introduced me to AA, an American girl, I ended up going back with her to the States. And I was bouncing in and out of AA then, and living in Marin County, just on the other side of the Golden Gate Bridge. And I had a 6-month period of sobriety, but I knew I had a relapse coming any day now, which was just my kind of normal MO to get to 6 months, thinking I could have a beer and then I'd be drunk for another 6 months, and my life would go to shit again. And so at this point where I was thinking, oh God, you're going to, I'm going to have a relapse again. I can just feel it. Some LSD passed in front of me, being in Marin County.
Oh, wow.
And I said, I think I need to buy some of that. And so I did. I bought 5 hits or something or other. And then a couple of days later, I sat down with LSD with the intention of breaking that cycle of alcohol use. And it worked. Within about 4 hours of that experience, I knew that my relationship with alcohol was over. Now, I wouldn't say it was just that LSD experience, is everything that had built up to it. All of, like, I'd already lost a marriage in the Philippines, just all of the stuff that comes with an alcohol use disorder. I was at that point where I was just like, this has to stop. And the insights I got within those first 4 hours, I just knew I was done. That was it. It was kind of like everything I had learned in AA, or everything I'd learned about recovery, is kind of like a penny dropped, and I got it. I realized that life would be awesome if I just stopped drinking. And I'd hear that in AA, some old timer would say, Garyth, if you don't drink, you can't get drunk, and that's, yeah, great, but that hasn't stopped this compulsion for me to continue drinking. And but then that did, and then immediately I got onto the internet, which was, back then, a friend of mine had a computer, And so it was like, and so I, was looking into psychedelic recovery from drug use, and then that's when I came across Ibogaine, and I'd known about Iboga when I had a gargantuan psilocybin trip when I was like 16, and then I had to know more about this stuff, and so one of our local bookshops had the Lawrence Cherniak's great books of Hashish and Plants of the Gods by Albert Hoffman. So I got those two books then, and I learned a lot about different compounds in plant medicine and stuff. And so I learned about Iboga then, and it was kind of high up on my to-do list, but it didn't really explain about the addiction breaking qualities then, which is in the later editions now. And so then I started looking about Ibogaine, and I wasn't about to start giving LSD to people with an alcohol use disorder, which I have done since then, but this was back in, this was almost 24 years ago now. It'll be 24 years ago this August. And so that's when I found out about Ibogaine, and I was like, oh, well, Ibogaine's legal in Canada. I'm going to go to Canada and open up an Ibogaine clinic. And that was like 22 years ago or something. And then I met my ex-wife at a Burning Man party, and it all got put on the back burner for a few years as I was trying to get out of California, So it had been something I'd wanted to do for a long time. And a friend of mine from AA had a relapse with heroin and crystal meth. And the guy that was going to be my sponsor, who couldn't be my sponsor because he started drinking ayahuasca, and he came to me and said, Garyth, I'm not doing AA anymore, I'm drinking ayahuasca. And then I did LSD a couple of weeks later, so we kind of left AA. And one of the reasons for leaving AA was also is that because I don't believe in that disease model, and that's very much at the forefront of the Alcoholics and Narcotics Anonymous. Yeah. But we had a mutual friend that had a relapse, and I said, oh, he needs to go and do Ibogaine. And he's like, oh, what's Ibogaine? And I told him about it, and then he went and told our mutual friend. And oddly enough, this is the second time he'd heard about Ibogaine in 2 days. And so then he did his own research. He saved money over 6 months, and then he went and got a treatment. And then I was hearing all about his treatment and everything, and so that solidified. I got to go to Canada and start working with Ibogaine. So that's kind of what kicked that off. A long time ago, it didn't come into fruition for a long time, but that was my goal.
How did the entry into working with it go? Did you first experience it yourself for the purpose of working with it?
Yes, I did. And so I'd wanted to work with it for a long time, but then I was importing my wife at the time from California into Canada. So I had to get an ordinary job. And, I was working construction, so I was painting and stuff. And I had some, this is it's about 13 years ago now, but I have a daughter in the UK. I have a daughter and grandchildren. But due to addiction when I was younger, I didn't have a relationship with her. And I was going back to Britain to meet her for the first time. And through all of that stress, I developed a lot of back pain, and which I know was all wrapped around the emotions of that now. And I went to the doctor and I got T3s, which are it's the lowest kind of like opioid medicine you can get, prescription medicine. And so I started with T3s so I could finish this job, get on the plane to go to Britain, and I had an opiate relapse. Within days, I was using opiates, and then I traveled with some prescription opiates and got more opiates when I got there. And so by this time, I was kind of 3 weeks into a full-blown opioid relapse. And I hadn't been addicted to opiates for a very long time. So I took Iboga while I was there, when I was back in Britain. I ordered it online, which is a very foolish thing to do. It arrived and I took it. And it changed everything. changed everything in my life. But yeah, had I not
Did you
taken
get to
Iboga
meet
when
your daughter still?
yes,
that
I
trip?
did, while I was still on opiates, which was terrible. But yeah, but we patched that one up afterwards. She'd gone through that with her own mother and everything, and so for me to show up, all these years later on opiates was just awful for me. But anyhow, I took Iboga then after I'd seen her. I'd gone back for a family wedding as well, and that's kind of how that whole thing happened. And but I took Iboga in a very haphazard way in a friend's pop-up trailer in his garden. And at midnight, he was like, "Yeah, well, it's time for my bed. I'll see you in the morning." Where I just that was a terrifying Iboga treatment at the time, but it worked.
Yeah.
I didn't have to come back to Canada and go on methadone, which I would have done had I not. With the opiates and also drinking or a lot of the drugs, I'm like, you get wired in a certain way, and then you do some kind of a treatment or you get off them one way, but that wiring has just been undone like that. And it's for most of us, we've only got to engage, and then you rewire.
Yeah, those pathways are there, even if you interrupt the patterns. It takes time to really reform and lay down the new ones and put that distance.
And then it's still hanging out there in the back.
There, yeah.
Do you know what I mean? You've only got to use a couple of times, and then that neuroplasticity, it just goes right back to where you were, and it's such a well-trodden pathway, So and it's
the brain remembers
to people, when they. So,
like your example with Tylenol number 3s and codeine and the most conservative pain med you could try, and right back into the thick of it, it sounds like.
Oh, within days. Well, I was going through a lot of emotional stuff and a lot of shame, which, was a huge driver for addiction anyhow. And within the next day, I was hopping out of bed in the morning so as I could knock back 2 or 3 of those pills with my hot cup of tea in the morning, So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so Ibogaine is a fascinating medicine. In fact, last summer at the MAPS conference in Denver, Colorado, there was a screening of a documentary called Of Night and Light by Lucy Walker that told a lot of the U.S. history of it with lab cough and how he discovered it. But wondering
if I haven't seen that.
Yeah, if you could. Yeah, it's a beautiful movie, and I think one of the researchers in there, Nolan Williams, said that this is the most technologically advanced plant medicine he's ever seen, or something like that. And I find it intriguing in not only its pattern interruption, but physiologically, like how it can help with withdrawals for people too. Yeah. And I wonder if you could just share your view of Ibogaine, how you work with it, and what happens when people come and get that big experience.
Sure. Well, we're not exactly sure what's happening. I'm sure we will do, once they've finished doing a lot of clinical trials and stuff, then we'll know a lot more. So a lot of it's kind of anecdotal, really, and not really fully understanding how its mechanisms work. It's a very unique plant medicine. I had all of these ideas in my head as to how it was going to be before I took it, and when I took it, it was nothing like what I was expecting. It's a classic tryptamine, like LSD, and it's a dissociative psychedelic like ketamine and 5-MeO DMT. But it's one of its major properties is that it's an oneric, and oneric is a waking dream. So it's not like tripping on mushrooms or anything like that. It's very unique in the way that it works. So the oneric is waking dream, or it's like very, very heavy daydreaming, with images that can come up for people. Some people get this whole life review, and I'm not always, sure that people are going to get that. And a lot of people are expecting they're going to get that. That's the problem with the internet. People, they write the peak experiences are the ones that make it to the internet. Out of 20 people that take Ibogaine, like there's one that kind of knocks it out of the park, and they're the ones that end up on the internet, and but they're back with a tribe in Africa, and all of their problems are coming out and onto the fire and stuff, which is one of the kind of trip reports I got from one of the people I was working with. But for a lot of people, it's not like that, and a lot of people expect that. Which you could say that about a lot of psychedelics, that people are expecting what they've read as the ultimate peak experience, which, as we know, everybody's experience is very subjective from one person to the next.
Yeah, I'm glad. I'm glad you're mentioning this, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about it, because I imagine you've sat with countless people through their Ibogaine experiences and have had your own, and there is that narrative that people say about it in terms of life review. But I like the term you brought up, oneirogen, like the awaking dream, or I guess dream creation, that I've seen mostly applied to Ibogaine uniquely. And I think that helps just open it up to an experience that may not be just like a review of your life on a screen in front of you.
I'm not overly interested in what happens during the experience. Of course, if there's some life stuff or traumatic stuff that gets revisited, well, of course, that's very important. But for a lot of people, it's a bit like a defrag. It's like the brain is being rebooted or something, or there's some defragging going on. So for a lot of people, it's very confusing. They're like, this shit's weird. Especially if they have other experience with other plant medicines, and then they engage with this. Sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it makes more sense afterwards. My experience, for example, was Pink. That artist Pink has a song, Raise Your Glass, and it's all about drinking and getting really messed up and drunk. And my Iboga experience was that video, starting at the beginning, clear like I was watching it on a TV screen, all the way to the end as I was dry heaving into a bucket. And then it went back to the beginning and did it again, and then did it again and did it again. And so it was all of this stuff about drinking. And I hadn't drank in like 10 years or something, 11 years. There was a point where the spirit of the medicine screamed at me, "You had an opiate relapse. Why did you do that?" And I was like, I've been telling myself that for the last 2 weeks. I don't really need you chiming in. Thank you, though. So, and then the video experience went on for like 15 hours or something. And then it went into a different phase, which was more reflective. So what was the deep meaning of the Pink video? It was just showing me about my, I guess, all the parts of my behavior. But what was interesting was after I'd had a sleep and I woke up that next day, and I remember I went to the back door of my friend's house and I inhaled, and it's like I could identify 1,000 different things that I just smelt, that were in the air. I'm neurodivergent, so things are a little bit foggy at the best of times. It was my laser kind of attention. And then the clarity I had about my life and what I'd been doing in the previous 46 years was very clear to me in those next 3 months. So I'm more interested, and then also some people, when they do high dose Ibogaine, don't remember anything. It's like taking too much MDMA on the dance floor. You had a good time between midnight and 4, but you have no recollection of it at all. And so that happens also with people with Ibogaine, is they might not have any recollection of it. which it can also happen with 5-MeO as well. But that doesn't mean to say that nothing's been done, you know. So it's kind of the work that's been done during that period that you may or may not be conscious while it's going on, or it may or not be very insightful. It's kind of it's the integration afterwards, really, and the piecing it all together. You know, and with Ibogaine, unlike a lot of the other medicines, it's almost like you got an inbuilt therapist that's attached in some ways as well. For a lot of people, not for everybody, because, you know, this whole thing is subjective from person to person. So, but it's almost like I was held for 3 months and I knew exactly which direction I was going in life. It was incredible. And then I woke up one morning and I was like, oh no, it's leaving. I can feel it's leaving. I don't just have quite as much Ibogaine floating around in my system. And I managed to source some root bark and trickle a little bit back in there, and it just felt good, but it wasn't something I had to continue doing. You know, when I took Iboga, it changed my life. Totally. And then it set me on this path. It was a path I already wanted to be on, but it gave me the courage and the strength. My marriage fell apart immediately after that as well, which is not uncommon with something like that, which freed me up to do exactly what I wanted to do. So I took it in August. By the following February, I was training with people in Mexico. So.
And what's the work like that you do, or the container? Like, if someone, are these individuals in the throes of addiction? And if so, at what stage does it matter? And how long do you work with people? How many doses? Is this a big dose?
Things have changed. In like I was saying, I'm going into my 13th year now, and things have changed. Like, there is no heroin anymore. So, you know, what we would do, we had a doctor that worked with us back then, because back then Ibogaine was an unlicensed natural health product, and so it wasn't in any kind of restricted area to be working with it. And so we had a doctor that we'd gotten through Gabor, I believe, a bit of a renegade doctor who was happy to work with us. And so she would prescribe the opiates that we needed and stuff. And so we would bring people in, switch them to morphine for a bit, and then we would do some low dose for a few days, getting most of that, if there was fentanyl in their system, kind of getting it out by the time we were doing the high dose. So what we would do is work in low doses, and this is kind of how I work now, is that you can work in a low dose with somebody. What happens is that people take Ibogaine instead of an opiate dose, and then that works for about 4 hours, and they're not in any kind of withdrawal during that period of time. And then 4 hours later, you just put them back onto morphine. But it's always considerably less morphine than they were on. It's actually in a percentage. I won't go into the details exactly of how I do it, because I don't want desperate people thinking they can do this by themselves at home. You know, so that's how we were doing it in the beginning when the doses were smaller. You know, like somebody had a $100 a day dope habit, that might have been, 400 or 500 milligrams of morphine. Now a $50 a day fentanyl habit could be 2,000 milligrams of morphine. So for us, so we did everything in the way of flood dosing back then, but I don't do that now with people on high doses of opiates. I do it in a different way. I do it more of a titration coming off of, just because you can't really knock it out in any way now like we used to be able to do. You know, due to the drug war, now the drug supplies are poisoned with fentanyl. There's no need for people in Afghanistan anymore. You know, that's a direct result of the drug war. You know, I don't say I have any of the answers or all the answers to how to deal with this drug war, but the drug war they've had this war in place since 1970 in its form now, and there's more and more drugs, and they're cheaper and cheaper and stronger than ever. So just by looking at it from those kind of terms, we can see the drug war has been an absolute failure, and more, it's just caused more harm. Had we had heroin dispensaries downtown 10 years ago, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in right now, you know.
So Garyth, you mentioned because of the drug war, it's harder to help people get off because of some of the fallout of this. And just for our listeners to maybe simplify it, it's my understanding, and we have had an Ibogaine doctor from Brazil, Dr. Bruno Rasmussen, on here many months ago, though, talking about his protocol of leading up to it. You'd switch someone from, say, a longer acting opiate to morphine at a very precise kind of medically supervised approach. And a dose, depending on if there are withdrawal symptoms, you might have to manage some of that. But you said it's been harder with fentanyl. And now how do you do it? How do you make that switch from someone heavily using to being ready to go into Ibogaine?
Well, here's the thing. So now it's like, can people make that switch? Because also another problem that we have is now that the drug supply is not only tainted with fentanyl, but it's also tainted with tizolam and other benzodiazepines, which just makes them so much more addictive. So most people that are using that kind of street dope, we can't work with, unfortunately. You know, as I was saying, had there been heroin dispensaries downtown, because nobody wanted to be using this trash that's out there at the moment. Everybody was quite happy with heroin, thank you very much. And then the heroin just got harder and harder and harder to get hold of. You know, so a lot of people now, and there are a lot of people on safe supply that are using Dilaudid and morphine. So those are the people that we work with mostly, or people that can make that switch. We send them to the rapid access addiction clinic so they can get on morphine. And if they can jump through those hoops, then we can work with them. Or otherwise, you know, somebody has to come up. I have to keep them on morphine for a long time if they're coming from the States. I was making switches from fentanyl to morphine back when I had a doctor working with us. So it's not too hard if somebody's in my care. But if somebody's got switched to morphine but still has the ability to go get street drugs, then it's very difficult for them to stop. So the group of people that we can work with has gotten smaller and smaller. And the outrageous doses that people come in on now as well from the RAC clinic, you know, like 1,500 milligrams of morphine and stuff. You know, if you get banged up in a car accident, the most they're going to want to give you in a 24-hour period, if your body's totally smashed, is like 200 milligrams of morphine in a 24-hour period. So now you got these. I spoke to a guy on the phone the other day that's on 3,000 milligrams of morphine and some Dilaudid, and using a little bit on the street stuff as well. So I'm like, sorry, buddy, I can't, you know. I direct those people to more medically assisted places in Mexico. Or what we do is I work in that same way with the heavy opiate people. They come and stay with us for 2 weeks. They come and live with us. And, you know, in the morning, they will do Ibogaine instead of an opiate dose, usually between 10 and 2. And then in the afternoon, I just put them back on morphine. And it goes like that day in, day out. Now, this is how I feel that the medical establishment will work with Ibogaine for opiates once it gets accepted by the medical establishment, which it will eventually. It's just how many more people we got to have die before they go, oh, okay, yeah, now we're willing to do this. You know, now they're willing to dish out morphine and Dilaudid, you know. So, which is what, and in places like Holland, they just give people heroin because that's what they really need. And that's what the half-life is much longer. So, you know, why don't you just give people what they're addicted to? You know, or the next best thing that's going to keep them happy. But, you know, and some of the addiction clinics are actually giving people fentanyl now, you know, and then putting fentanyl patches on people, putting them on Valium because they're addicted to benzos and fentanyl. So I understand if some people can stay with the program, then we're being helped out in that way. But like I was saying, if we'd had heroin clinics downtown, you know, 10, 15 years ago, we wouldn't be in the problem that we're in right now. But, you know, it's like the authorities are addicted to prohibition, you know. So did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm off on tangents.
Yeah, no, it's when I'm a psychiatrist, and when someone comes into me and benzo or alcohol withdrawal, we know what we need to do, right? To not for the long term, but for the short term. It gets much more complicated with these street drugs and combos of doses, but you know, I have check boxes and protocols for whether it's a Librium or Ativan withdrawal taper to avoid the scary physiologic consequences and DTs and all that. But so say someone is a candidate to work with you, how many doses of Ibogaine are you seeing are needed, and how much integration are we talking about?
As far as doses, the opiate people, it really depends on their situation, how at risk they are. Like your average, my average Percocet housewife isn't at the same kind of risk in a lot of respects as somebody that's coming from the street. But I'm not, to tell you the truth, I'm not working with that many people that are that vulnerable, you know, unless the resources can be found to pack them off to some kind of aftercare afterwards. You know, because a big concern for us is treating somebody and them then leaving and using drugs. You know, because then after Ibogaine, their bodies are basically opiate naive. You know, so it's not cookie cutter at all. I had a film producer guy, come from LA. Will be 2 years ago this November, and he'd already done Ibogaine. He'd gone down to Mexico and done flood dose Ibogaine twice, but because his opiate dose was so high with the black tar, with the fentanyl black tar that he was using, they just didn't give him enough Ibogaine. And here's my thing: it's not really about the flood dose now. It's more about how much Ibogaine I get into somebody and what kind of integration work they're doing afterwards. You know, I work with different integration specialists. I work with my Ibogaine people. I like to work with Anders Beatty from the Ibogaine Counseling Services. He's in the UK. He had a 20-25 year run with cocaine and crack. And from our perspective, it doesn't really matter what the substance is. You know, it's really being involved in addiction. Like, I've been addicted to opiates, crystal meth, and alcohol, and they're all quite different in their actions. But at the time, they're all doing exactly what I needed them to do. You know, so so it's different by case. If somebody doesn't have the resources to get the right support that I feel that they need, I won't work with them. Yeah, you know, it's kind of like the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? And you know, we don't do Ibogaine emergencies. Most of the people we work with have been in addiction for quite some time. You know, so it's not like we got to fix this person, or do you know what I mean? We've got to work out how it's got to be a plan. It's got to be a carefully worked out plan, and then it's got to be executed. You know, like there should be aftercare involved, and there should be, you know, integration, you know, with Anders or a host of other people that I work with. You know, so it's not cookie cutter by any means. And I feel that a lot of the places in Mexico are like that. You know, they've got beds to fill, medical tourism. Yeah, come on down, you know, and it's like a quick rush through. And I get it, you know, because they're kind of supplying a service of detox. But Ibogaine's way more than that, and shouldn't be treated like a 5-day drive-through, you know? So, you know, sometimes you're limited on what people's resources are, and if you feel that you can work out a good plan, then we'll work with people. But the opiate people are 2 weeks, and sometimes longer. That film producer guy that came, well, when I stabilized him, he was damn near on 2,000 milligrams of morphine. And the problem was that, you know, his receptor sites just hadn't received enough Ibogaine. And so he does the flood dose, and they're all like, oh, yeah, and he might have had a great experience or not remember anything or however it was going to be. But his body doesn't have enough Ibogaine in it. And that's why he went down there twice and relapsed twice afterwards. And then he came and stayed for us for almost a month. And most people leave us with Ibogaine coming out of their ears. And they're like, no more of that stuff. But I make it very clear to people that the more of that shit they take, the better they're going to feel on the flip side. And the more of it they take, the clearer they're going to be. And the more hopefully that that trauma and addiction is behind them. But it's only a powerful addiction interrupter. And it's what people do with that time that makes all the difference. And I don't have a lot of control over that, but I try and make sure that we've got a really good plan set in place. Like our last guy just is down here close to me in Mexico. He went to Inscape, which is like an Ibogaine aftercare facility place. So he's there for 6 weeks. And then I think he's going to do some more aftercare.
I love this individualized approach you mentioned, and also taking that. We talk a lot about harm reduction these days, but taking it like to extend in all directions, if you will. Just knowing like needing someone to really be ready. It's not just. It's one thing to have the good intention, but it's got to be a feasible plan. You need those supports. You need, like you said, you don't want to be vulnerable, off of medicine and prone to relapse. That could be very, very dangerous, or even more so, right?
Yeah. Well, a lot of people now they're not trying to get people into abstinence. With the opiate people, they're getting them into rehab and then getting them stable on something like methadone or morphine or Suboxone. And they're not even trying to get them off of those drugs now, because that's a lot of people are very much at risk after that, particularly if they have a history of relapsing and stuff. And now the drugs out there are so dangerous, So we work differently with other people, depending on what it is. We still do flood dosing, but that's more for alcohol and for stimulants, cocaine, meth, that kind of thing.
And
so
could you define flood dosing for the listeners? Because Ibogaine is unique in so many ways, but I understand that sometimes people do test doses to see like, what's this going to do to your metabolic kind of cardiovascular responses, allergic reactions? That's not always considered needed, but then like there's flood doses and boosters, but sounds like another approach is just give it in little spurts along the way for a total dose over days.
Yeah, with the opiate thing, what we call that is more of a saturation dose, because we're saturating their bodies with Ibogaine, but we can only get that much Ibogaine into them safely over a 2-week period. You can't push it into them faster than that, and then I might send them off with boosters as well. But if we're working with people, like for stimulants, for example, and I'm going to do a flood dose, well, the first day that they come in would just be getting settled in. The second day would be like that test dose, but that's kind of like, maybe 3 milligrams per kilogram or something like that. So it's enough that there's going to be some cardiac change. The blood pressure and the heart rate will drop. So I'm seeing that kind of like the responses for the physiological responses, and also seeing how sensitive they are. So I can then make some kind of have an idea as to how heavily I want to dose somebody the next day. And then so the next day, my nurse will fly over from the island, and then we'll get ready for a flood dose. And we normally start that around about midday, and then we have somebody with that person normally for 18 hours. The first 6 hours, they're going to need help to the bathroom, to pee and stuff. There might be some vomiting. But we monitor, we're actually sitting with people for that first 18 hours. They have that experience. And the experience is normally 36 hours. It's not like they're tripping or having the intense experience for 36 hours. It kind of goes into different phases, but they might not get any sleep for 36 hours, and then after that. So we start at midday and then we go right the way round. And so I'm with them normally until 6 a.m. and then I pull off and then hopefully they're getting some sleep that night, and a lot of insights in during that time. And then they would get the next day off, and then it would be repeated days of Ibogaine after that. And so as I can get more Ibogaine into them, and it's a dose that would be still impactful, but it wouldn't be keeping them awake at night. And it might not be having the same psychological effects after having a large dose go through them, but it means that there's more Ibogaine in their system, which means there's more nor-Ibogaine, which is the addiction interrupter, which floats around in the brain and the body, which keeps people in that, getting the monkey off their back, basically. And then it's what they do during that 3-month period to deal with the trauma that's been driving the addiction anyhow, which is childhood trauma. But then also when people get involved in street drug use, well, there's PTSD just from their drug use, just from what they've been doing just to stay well every day. I can't even try to get people to understand what it's like to be addicted to opiates. It's just horrendous. It's like you're going to be deathly ill in 4 hours' time.
Yeah, you have no idea what it's like unless you've experienced that dark night of the soul. Is the way I've heard so many people describe it. And I've done a lot of opiate withdrawal studies of different things trying to help soften the blow of that non-fatal withdrawal syndrome, but way more uncomfortable than almost anything I've seen.
It's like you're trying to turn your body inside out on a cellular level. I can't even describe it. It's got to be the most uncomfortable feeling in the world while you're expelling from both ends at the same time as well.
And so before we scare people away from it with that, no, I'm just kidding, but like, what do you see next? Like what kind of success rate if someone is really engaged, or why Ibogaine instead of something else for these people?
Because of the addiction interruption, nothing else. Like with the LSD, I mean, the LSD worked for me, but I'd been sober for 6 months, so I wasn't dealing with DTs or anything like that. For opiate withdrawal, there's nothing like it. Like people don't go through any opiate withdrawal when they're with us. It's all timed. I know exactly when they need their morphine before they do. Because if they're uncomfortable, the whole point of them coming to us is to avoid that. And I have a certain amount of PTSD around opiate withdrawal as well. So if I can see somebody's visibly uncomfortable in my presence, then I'm normally a little bit uncomfortable. So we just do our utmost to make sure that they don't go into any withdrawal. Having said that, taking Ibogaine isn't easy. It's like dealing with a lot of shadow material and stuff that it's like being the opposite place from being on opiates. You're kind of like, it's nice and quiet, a little nap, you feel quite comfortable in your little cocoon or something. And then Ibogaine's like, boom, you're not in that cocoon anymore. And you might be thinking about a whole lot of other things you don't normally like to think about. But, that's part of the healing process. Having said that, I haven't seen more thrown at people on Ibogaine than they can handle, which I have seen with mushrooms and LSD or even cannabis oil over the years. So because of its actions as well, and if something is particularly disturbing, then, they can lift the eye mask and talk to Garyth or whatever, and it will kind of pull them out of whatever that particular thing was at the time. Whereas mushrooms, if you're peaking on mushrooms and you take the eye mask off, well, you're still peaking on mushrooms, So in some respects, it's hard to describe the Ibogaine thing, but people don't go through withdrawal, and it can get hard to take, especially with the opiate thing where they're having to take it day in, day out. And for drug users, it appeals to them, like, oh, I can take this drug to get off of that drug. But when they come in for opiate detox, I explain to them, like, this isn't going to be easy. You're not going to have any withdrawals, but I'm not going to tell you this is going to be easy. And in some respects, it shouldn't be, because then people will be like, and I know people do this, that have the the funds
They
or the
could just
resources to
come
do
in
it.
for a tune-up. Yeah.
So yeah, and then it's like, yeah. So there are people that have abused Ibogaine in that respect as well. They use it as a kind of a cleanup tool. But I think then they're just not doing the right integration around the work. They're coming having a peak experience and not really delving into the depths of their own psyche or leaning into why they've been experiencing this. So bypassing,
Yeah.
if you will.
No, I appreciate you just kind of telling it like it is on Ibogaine. I know I've learned some things and have some, I think, broadened perspective. And I'm wondering if, well, we're kind of out of time, so and I know you have to catch a flight today as well. But wondering if you have anything else you'd like to share and where people can find you if you're open to pointing them in
sure.
that direction.
Yeah, we can be pretty easily found just in a Google search, either by my name, Garyth Moxey, or innerrealmcenter.com, all one word. Center is spelled
Beautiful.
the American way, so as our cousins from the South don't get confused and stuff. So,
Okay.
it's not spelled the French way. But yeah, we can be found through that search. Most of our work is Ibogaine. I'm actually at the moment, I've been helping out at a 5-MeO DMT retreat. We work with 5-MeO as well. I did a training with these guys last year. I've actually been working with 5-MeO at the end of Ibogaine treatments for the last 8 years. And then now, over the last few years, there's been more and more interest just in the 5-MeO. So some of our work is not so much working in addiction, but also, working with 5-MeO. But most of the people that are coming to work with us, nobody's really whistling Dixie. It's not, doesn't have to be addiction. A lot of people are dealing with, trauma, depression, anxiety. And Ibogaine works very well for that as well. You don't have to be in addiction to work with Ibogaine. And there's an enormous amount of neuroplasticity that happens with Ibogaine and 5-MeO. So we always use 5-MeO at the end of our treatment, and there's a combination, there's a synergy that happens with those two compounds together, which kind of sets people up in a good place to move forward into their integration phase or recovery phase.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So it's not just about just showing up and taking the drugs. And unfortunately, there's, Ibogaine and 5-MeO have been kind of banded around like that, like cures and what have you. And I don't want to downplay its efficacy, but they're both just tools at the end of the day. And it's how you incorporate those tools with other modalities that can bring about benefit maximization. So.
Yeah, beautiful. And I have spent some time on the Inner Realm Center website, and I think there's some beautiful resources there as well that describe it. And I wish we could spend another hour. Maybe we'll have to do that again sometime soon, talking about 5-MeO. And
that would be great, because that's a whole topic all by itself. 5-MeO.
Yeah. And a fun one. But Garyth, thank you so much for your time and wisdom and experience and sharing your story.
Thank you, Reid. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.